Hello friends, I've been working on a pattern for baby Chelsea boots for the last little while, and show them to you. Make sure you hit subscribe and the bell notification because I'm going to launch the video and I'm going to give all 5 sizes for free in the first 24 hours. So make sure you watch that video and download the files when it comes out. But I figured I'd show you guys some of the work that goes behind all the pattern making here and offer some tips on how to make better patterns. I don't know if they're really tips. They're more like statements of facts. But that doesn't sound as good for a video title, so I'm gonna stick with tips. My first tip is work backwards from an existing product, so reverse engineering or whatever you'd like to call it. I usually go to the thrift store, I'll buy a bag, and then I'll tear it apart and get a general sense of the pattern. If you're just looking to recreate a bag, you can just tear it apart, iron it out so it's perfectly flat, lay it on a grid, like a cutting mat with a 1-inch grid, or whatever grid, and then take a top-down picture of it, bring it into Illustrator, and then draw a 1-inch square in Illustrator, and then line up the grid with that 1-inch square. And then you trace it with the pen tool, and voila, you have a pretty accurate pattern. For a 3D pattern like a shoe for this Chelsea boot, I actually used masking tape, and I used my own boot, and I covered it in masking tape, and then I traced around all the lines with a Sharpie marker. I peeled it off, and then I put it on a piece of paper, and I ended up with this, which frankly looks really ugly. And so from this, I made this. This was my first version of the shoe. For some simpler things, you may not need to do this and you can just jump right into pattern making, but I find for more complicated things, it always helps to at least have some frame of reference. That brings me to the second tip, which is to do your research. So go to the store, look at the bags, touch the bags, see how they're made, learn something, right? There's also lots of books out there that are super helpful. This book is called Bag Design by Fashionary. I don't know if it still exists out there, but I find this book super helpful. It has a reference page at the back, and it gives some really helpful information like how long straps are, how big bags are, how big to make the bag, stuff like that. The other thing I do is I go to a lot of retailers' websites and I look at their sizing and dimensions. Specifically for these baby shoes, I went to like Carter's and Oshkosh and Old Navy and I looked up their size guide for baby shoes. And it gives you a pretty good frame of reference, at least a ballpark of how big a 6 to 9 month old foot is, or like a 12 to 18 month how big and long their foot is. And it kind of gives you something to build your pattern with. So the third tip I have is learn how to use Illustrator or CAD. I'm not particularly good with CAD, and by particularly good I mean I don't know how to use it at all, but I do know how to use Illustrator. And as a disclaimer, I'm still using Illustrator CS6, which is 12 years old or something, because we have not jumped on Creative Cloud because the subscription model is very annoying. But yeah, CS6 came out in 2012 and that's a very long time ago. The iPhone 5 just came out, Steve Jobs just died, TikTok didn't exist, the Apple Watch didn't exist, planking was still popular. 7,000 people were hospitalized for eating Tide Pods. Gangnam Style hit 1 billion views on YouTube. The New York Giants won the Super Bowl, and the New York Jets were and are still terrible. Go Bills. With that being said, here are 5 important functions on how to use an obsolete version of Illustrator. I'm really selling this. In my defense, these functions still exist and haven't changed too drastically, if at all. So here we go. The first essential function is the pen tool, which is basically the heart of Illustrator. This may be the biggest learning curve, no pun intended, but learning how to use the pen tool is super important and how to manipulate the anchors. This is probably the most essential thing you need to learn in Illustrator to draw any pattern. The second thing is the align and distribute functions. These are extremely straightforward. They do exactly as the function says, align and distribute, and it ensures things are perfectly centered and aligned. The third thing is the pathfinder. This tool allows you to quickly manipulate different shapes to create other more complex shapes and combine or subtract them. It's super handy in pattern making because it ensures accuracy and efficiency.
The fourth tool is the offset tool. I use this a lot for adding seam allowance and stitch lines to patterns. And the fifth thing is not really a tool, but it's called document info. This is super important when you're adding gussets of any kind. This gives you the total length of the path, which is especially difficult to measure with irregular shapes. So for like the baby boot pattern, I had to make sure that the outside of the sole length was equal to this length here and this length here. And that way I knew that would be a perfect fit when you actually assemble the pieces together.
And the fourth one, I'm going to say it, but you're probably going to have a refund on this video, is just to make it. I find that I actually learn the most when I make the pattern over and over again, which is tedious and so annoying. But for something that is actually a 3D shape, like the shoe, you just need to make it. Here's all the versions I've worked through. There's 11 iterations here, so it's taken quite a few builds to make this. When I'm trying to work out a pattern, I don't worry about making it pretty. I just make sure every time you make it, you're learning something new. People often make their initial prototypes with like paper or cardboard or cardstock, and those are really good things for a number of patterns. But for something like the shoe pattern, I'd really recommend buying craft felt from like the dollar store and using that instead, just because it just behaves more similarly to leather. For my duffel bag pattern, all the prototypes I did were made with clearance fabric from the fabric store. You can buy some heavyweight vinyl fabric at the fabric store for like $2 a yard, and it's way cheaper than leather. All right, so the fifth thing is to test it out. You gotta make sure that these patterns work. I actually took these shoes to my mom's group at church and I put them on a bunch of babies.
I don't want to. I want to take it off.
But you love them, right? There was definitely some screaming and crying, but I got it together eventually. But I got the gist of the improvements I needed to make. I was looking to make sure my sizing was correct and it was in the right ballpark for the kids. I was making sure that the kids could walk properly in the shoes, that it was comfortable, that it looked good and stayed on, and I also had to make sure that you could put them on easily. So yeah, it's important to test out your pattern. This is kind of the final thing I have to say about this. It's not really a tip, I didn't really number this, but if you're making a pattern for yourself, you can kind of be lazy about how you finish it off. But for me, when I'm making a pattern to sell, you've got to make everything super clear and super professional and super tidied up. I add a legend, I add seam allowances, I always add the size gauge, like this 1-inch square here, so people know that they've printed it exactly to size, because printers will print at 97% or 102%, and people need to know it's printed correctly. And then to finish it off, I make a set of written instructions. I usually film the video, and then I take some pictures and put it up on Etsy, and that's pretty much my process for making a pattern. Thanks again so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next video. Can you walk around for me? Please. I'll give you a little candy.
Here you go.